Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'd like to welcome you to NCTC's Conservation Lecture Series, one of the best and cheapest public lecture series out there. For 21 years, we've been bringing in scientists, authors, artists to explain what they're doing to help promote the American conservation movement. And today we have a special treat for you, Jon Waterman, who's been out here in the past, is one of our favorite speakers. He's been coming out to NCTC for at least 15 years, sharing his wonderful explorations. And let me tell you a little about Jon Waterman. Jon Waterman has worked as a wilderness guide and as a national park ranger, exploring in boats, on foot, or on dog sleds even, remote places, and many of the 62 national parks. Jon's received numerous grants from the National Geographic Society Expeditions Council, and his award-winning writing and photography have appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers, including very recently a series in the New York Times. He's also written 14 books on adventure and the environment, including Chasing Denali, and most recently, a book that I got this Christmas from my wife, National Geographic's Atlas of the National Parks, a book so big and so rich in content, it barely fits in my screen. So I'd like to, before we switch it over to Jon, thank the Friends of NCTC, who are the co-sponsor of this lecture series and help make it all possible. Thank all of you for bearing with us as we do a virtual public lecture series while we're still trying to recover from the recent COVID-19. And now I'd like to welcome Jon Waterman.
Thank you, Mark. And thanks everyone else for joining me today, for joining us today, live from Carbondale, Colorado. So I would like to take you with me on a journey through the national parks. I've been lucky enough to spend a better part of a lifetime exploring and working in these parks. I would like to share with you a quote from Gilbert Grosvenor, the legendary editor of the National Geographic Society, that a map is the greatest of all epic poems. Its lines and colors show the realization of great dreams. And parks, after all, are nothing if they aren't all about maps. These parks themselves are of land and a waterscape full of extremes. For instance, in Kentucky, there's over 400 miles of caves, more caves than anywhere else in the world in terms of the mileage. Or you could go to a place like Death Valley National Park in California, where we have the lowest below sea level landscape on the continent, as well as the greatest temperatures. 134 degrees was recorded there in the 30s, and that's likely to be broken this year. Many of the maps I'm about to share with you come from that book that Mark just showed to us, which was released by the National Geographic just in November. So I'm not only going to share some maps, but many graphics and photographs as well about the 62 national parks. So the parks, continuing on this theme of extremes, there's nothing like them anywhere else in the world. You know, the largest park of them all is Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska on the border of Canada. It's the largest non-polar ice fields in the world. It's a park the size of the country of Switzerland. So you can go from this ginormous ice fields to off the southern tip of Florida to Dry Tortugas National Park with the greatest coral reef in North America. I might add that this national park is also 90% water. So the parks were created about 104 years ago through an act called the Organic Act, signed into law by President Wilson. And the first director of the parks, Stephen Mather, considered it a bit of a dual mandate in creating these parks, because not only was the Park Service charged with preserving them and conserving them, but to leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And I'm going to come back to this, but I just wanted to plant this seed. It's one of the sort of the central challenges that we face today throughout the Park Service system. So the parks have unexpected depths and dimensions. This happens to be the tallest mountain in North America, encompassed by Denali National Park, but the park was not created really for this tallest of all mountains in North America. It was created to preserve the wildlife within, in particular, the Dall sheep, a very unique species, which was rapidly being hunted out as the railroad was being built into Alaska. And so that park was created in 1916. But my first visit to a national park was there to Denali in 1976, more than 40 years ago. And you can see that we were clad in clothing that's not really used anymore today, with external frame backpacks, largely wearing wool, no Gore-Tex on us. And we managed to climb very high on the mountain, turned around just short of the summit in the storm, and learned a lot. Had an amazing experience. And I had the opportunity to get to know some of the rest of the park as well. But I went back to the mountain again and again. I climbed it in winter here in 1982, and many times in summer with friends or even guiding the mountain. So I really would come to know this park quite well, particularly when I was hired as a National Park Service ranger and largely conducting rescues, some of them very highly technical, some of them from helicopters. And this was the great dream job of my life, working on the mountain. And not only working on the mountain, but getting to know the park even more, a park that is greater than the size of the state of Massachusetts. And here from this picture that I took on the north side of the park, there is more vertical relief here in this scene than anywhere else in the world. That's 18,000 feet from that tundra pond up to the summit. So it's an extraordinary place, again, with a depth and dimensions that are just unimaginable until you get there and wander about, quite goggle-eyed, I might add. This experience here, which I've done again and again, riding the shuttle bus through the park, is kind of a paradigm for many of the parks, these shuttle systems. And you can see not only those Dall sheep I mentioned earlier, but the predators, depending upon those sheep, such as these wild wolves here, happily posing for pictures with all those camera lenses sticking out at them, or the bears also in great number, and not really habituated to the people. These are wild animals. It's like akin to a Serengeti expedition, taking that shuttle bus 80 miles into Wonder Lake. A great service that is provided for these parks, among many things, aside from the physical parks themselves, is the cartography department, where there are 2 full-time cartographers. And back in the 90s, they hired the famed landscape panoramist from Austria, Heinrich Baran, to do a series of panoramas such as this one of Denali, where he sort of gently exaggerated the mountain and the glaciers surrounding Denali, as well as the surrounding park, to really give you a feel for what this place looks like. And he did this for more than a half dozen parks. This very unusual view here, looking south out of Yellowstone, across Yellowstone Lake, across Yellowstone Falls, south to Grand Teton National Park. And so eventually the Park Service would follow Baran's lead and create their own amazing, iconic series of maps, such as this map showing Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And here, through this very subtle use of shading, you get a sense for the lush grasslands of this park. This is a pre-publication map that shows you the grid lines that are used in every one of the national parks, all 419 units throughout the country, that allows them to standardize these parks. And it might be easy to take for granted the great care and diligence that goes into the cartography for these parks. Here's a completed map, of course. You can't see the grid lines, but laid out just as every other national park is laid out, but this time shown with that panoramic feel, giving us a great sense, sort of being there for that mile drop down into the depths of the canyon. A place that I've had the pleasure of going many times to not only see the wildlife, but to run the rivers. The Park Service has done an extraordinary job in restoring wildlife populations. For instance, the desert bighorn sheep was just about extinct, and the Park Service was able to get rid of the feral burros and reintroduce the species, and it's now seen in fairly abundant numbers at the bottom of the canyon. So you can see species from these megafauna to 5 different species of rattlesnakes there in the Grand Canyon, and in every kind of flora imaginable for the desert Southwest. Now, perhaps one of the ultimate experiences in Grand Canyon is to run that more than 200 miles of Colorado River that runs right through the foundation of the park. And there are hundreds of rapids. And surely these rapids are a great adrenaline rush, and it takes a lot of skill to run through them, whether you're rowing or paddling. But if you're really paying attention, there's something even more extraordinary going on here. Your boat becomes a veritable time machine if you're paying attention, looking at the layers of geology above you. Here you start at the 300 million year old Tapete sandstone, and as you continue down the river over a couple of weeks, you plunge back through time until finally you reach the 1.7 billion year old Zoroaster granite there at the bottom of the canyon, created through volcanism so long ago. So I have also worked here in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. Not only worked here, but repeatedly gone on climbing trips here. And I believe this is end of January, climbing the north face of a mountain called Notch Top, looking at the iconic Longs Peak in the background. Iconic because it's one of the tallest peaks in the state. And it was through this kind of not only work, but recreating that I really came to appreciate the ecosystems and come to indulge my curiosities about what was going on in a lot of these parks. Rocky Mountain has a very intact ecosystem for the most part. There are now populations of moose there that have come back, and many elk throughout the park. This, incidentally, is the beginning of the Colorado River. It starts there in Rocky Mountain National Park, running over 1,400 miles to Mexico. But there are challenges in the national parks, in particular here in Rocky, the 3rd most popular national park. If you get up in an airplane or even on some of the higher roads, you can look across what looks like a sea of dying trees here. These brown trees have been ravaged by the pine beetles that started hitting these trees about 15, 16 years ago. 90% of the forests within the park now are affected by pine or spruce beetles, and the park has a tremendous job just removing the dead wood, let alone the hazards, let alone forest fires that have been burning through this park like never before, some of them burning right through the winter. So moving across the country and the continent here to the Everglades, where I've been repeatedly visiting this park over the last couple of years. I once visited as a young boy too. And this is the first national park that was created more than anything for its biodiversity. There's a whopping 9 different habitats here in this park because it is rich with water, or used to be rich with water. And here in this graphic from my book, The Atlas of the National Parks, you can see how on the left side, pre-settlement, there was what ecologists refer to as the river of grass, 100 miles long and 60 miles wide, coursing through the Everglades and just infusing. It's really the arterial system, the heart of the Everglades. But as 6 million people eventually moved to Florida here on this right side graphic, they canaled the water west and east in various places out to the Atlantic. And so the lifeblood, very lifeblood of the Everglades was denied to it. And so this is a massive restoration project that Congress has appropriated more than $12 billion to fix over the next decade. And they've got their work cut out for them, along with rising oceans created by climate change. I'm going to share with you some video now from a trip I took across the park. And if we had the audio, you would hear him saying it. You'd be foolish not to be enjoying this day. And we are now looking at the Flamingo Visitor Center. That is one of 2 visitor centers in the park. This one was largely destroyed by Hurricane Irma, I believe. And the one on the northern side of the park was entirely demolished by the hurricanes. And recently, the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act is allowing the Park Service to address the billions of dollars worth of repairs and maintenance that need to be done to infrastructure throughout the park. So soon these 2 visitor centers are expected to be rebuilt. It's a park that's wonderful if you're interested in wading birds, from the snowy egrets made famous by an Audubon painting here, to the roseate spoonbills and flamingos. This roseate is surrounded by herons and egrets. You can just make out the dark heads of a couple of storks as well. It's the greatest collection of wading birds anywhere on the continent. And I took these pictures just right off the roadside. So again, like Denali, like many parks, the wildlife is very, very accessible and made accessible by the roadways and shuttle systems built for the parks. But again, this park is in trouble. I mentioned the climate change caused ocean rise, and these storm surges are now surging up over the mangroves. And here in this aerial I took, you can see all the browned mangroves. You can smell the stink of dying mangroves, the methane from these dying mangroves as we paddle through from south to north. And even more troubling, there are areas that from an airplane look like Swiss cheese, where the storm surges have washed over the sawgrass or the mangroves, and they've actually caused what ecologists refer to as peat collapse. And this peat collapse is
basically a devastation of the foundation of peat that was built up through the millennia here. And those roots are being killed by the salt water. So again, a great challenge here in this national park to restore it, let alone to figure out how to keep the ocean out of the park. My first visit there a couple of years ago, they found a very rare endangered Braid's whale that was, I should pronounce Buddhist whale, that was found dead floating nearby the park. And here they're performing a necropsy on the whale. I don't think they ever really learned what killed it, but they did find a great amount of plastic in its stomach. And like many parks, this park is plagued by invasive species, such as the Burmese python, or the most spectacular invasive species of them all, perhaps, because there may be as many as tens of thousands of these pythons throughout the park, decimating small mammal populations. And it's doubtful that they could ever eradicate all of these because they're so elusive and camouflaged, they're difficult to find. They've even been found suffocating and eating small deer and even an alligator. So again, this invasive species, both flora and fauna, is ubiquitous throughout the national parks, somewhat of a byproduct of climate change in many cases.
moving to the far side of the continent, to northern Alaska, there are 8 national parks here from northernmost Alaska, gates of the Arctic, down to Glacier Bay National Park. I've had a chance to both work and explore many of these parks. Collectively, the square miles contained in these parks is extraordinary amount of, it has shelters and houses an extraordinary amount of wildlife and really completely pristine country, just as it was in days of yore before settlement. Here you see the Wrangell St. Elias I was referring to earlier, the size of Switzerland. I have spent a fair amount of time in that park, as well as these other Canadian parks, and in Glacier Bay. Glacier Bay itself has over 1,000 glaciers, and I'm going to share with you some images from various trips I've done there. If you get up into an airplane, as I always try to do in my travels and parks, you get a sense for the expanse, and not only that, the diversity of this particular park. There's this long, continuous sand beach that you could walk for days, completely uninhabited, running into glaciers and mountains such as this mountain, Mount Fairweather, not aptly named, rising 15,300 feet above the sea. And I tried to climb this mountain one winter. We got very high on the mountain and we're stormed out near the summit. And we made the choice, rather than being flown out of here, we actually skied out, and then it ended up bushwhacking through what amounts to a veritable rainforest there along the coast. We got lost and turned around, looking at our compasses. We were assisted by this baying in the distance, which we thought to be a pack of wolves. So we just went to the noise, and we suddenly burst out of the forest into this bright light, out of the dark forest and these huge bear trails to a colony of sea lions there on the coast. On the other side of the park, right in the heart of the park in Glacier Bay itself, I had the opportunity to take a kayaking trip. In fact, I had a magazine assignment, and the offer was to ride a cruise ship into Glacier Bay, and I said I couldn't do the assignment unless I went on a kayaking trip first, so I could really get to know that end of the park, and was just astounded by these humpback whales feeding on capelin, jumping and diving with thunderous claps as these ton leviathans came back down in the water. Amazing spectacle. Again, the mountains rising many thousands of feet above us. The light here, those of you who have been to Alaska know that the sun doesn't set for much of the summer, so it's quite a wonderland. You can paddle on either side of midnight in the height of summer and just be suffused in this wonderful golden light. But we weren't so enchanted by the presence of the cruise ships. You see my companion here giving the middle finger salute to this cruise ships, because they're veritable floating cities, and they sometimes would blow their foghorns. If you're in the water in a kayak, they send up huge wakes, which you have to brace and balance yourself for not to capsize in. So when the kayaking trip ended and I boarded the cruise ship for the other way to look at the park, I had no small amount of trepidation. I was there with my wife at the time, and my one-year-old son, and my mother-in-law. We were sharing this cruise with 1,400 other passengers, so it is a floating city. And it was a completely different perspective, a completely different way of seeing this park. While there was Alaska literally baking above us, baked Alaska was being served below. But despite my cynicism, I came to see this as a remarkable opportunity for those people that didn't know how to paddle a kayak or didn't want to be in the wilderness. And the captain of the cruise ship, whom I got to know and dined with a couple of times, felt he had a mission, and that mission was to get people out on deck whenever there was wildlife visible and away from the ample food, the many dining tables and the gaming tables. And he believed he was creating environmentalists and that people would go home from these trips supporting wilderness causes. And I think he was right. I think he was sincere in this. And in the end, in my article, I was very kind to the cruise ship experience, because after all, if you took those 1,400 passengers and put them in kayaks, as we were originally, the impact would be enormous. So again, this is what we have done with our Park Service system. We've allowed entrance into these parks so that all people can enjoy them. And they don't necessarily have to get out there and sweat and crawl through the brush and bloody their knees. But then again, we don't want them all to, because the impact would be just too much on these parks. So I think the system is in a very delicate balance, but it provides for those millions of people in a wonderful way. We just have to figure out the preservation part. So we created these parks like Glacier, according to the Organic Act of 1916, in large part so that we could perform science in these parks. And so we know through this very extensive, for instance, meteorological record, that the temperatures in Glacier Bay in 1892 were much colder here at the Muir Glacier than they are today. And of course, that accounts for why these glaciers are receding. The same scene, the glacier has receded miles back as that warming continues. Or here at the Lamplugh Glacier, more than a century ago, the Lamplugh has also faded back just barely in view here, and it's left behind these huge rock marine piles. So on to the northernmost national park of them all, Gates of the Arctic, where I've had the opportunity to explore several times. In fact, I used to guide in this park throughout the park. You see that the park is connected not only to preserves, but nearby the Kobuk Valley National Park, where there's tremendous sand dunes, and surrounded by wildlife refuges. So it's an enormous, pristine Arctic landscape. Here, I want to draw your attention to this pink purplish proposed road here, which now has been approved by the Bureau of Land Management and the federal government. And there's currently a lawsuit in progress to try and stop this road, because as you see, it crosses a couple of wild and scenic rivers and could greatly impact the caribou migration through the park. It is truly a Tolkien-esque landscape here in the heart of the park, in a place I visited in the 80s called the Arrogate Spires. There would be a lot of rock climbers in here if it weren't so remote. Beautiful compact granite and just otherworldly looking peaks, or the caribou migration itself. Up to 300,000 of the Western Arctic caribou herd migrate through here every year, going north and then back south in the late summer. And these animals are trailed by all manner of predators, wolverines, wolves, bears. So it's another one of the great wildlife spectacles on Earth, and all carefully being preserved. Here you can look in the distance, and it's hard to have proper perspective because there are no trees in much of Gates of the Arctic, and certainly no buildings. So the valleys are incredibly broad, and you'll look across you think you're looking across the valley at a ground squirrel, when in fact you're looking many miles away at a grizzly bear. The ground squirrel, incidentally, is the world's only true hibernator. Its temperature just drops a decimal point or two below 32 degrees. Here in this Park Service patrol in 1982, the headwaters of the Noatak River, I stepped under the cut bank on a meander in the river, and I can show you literally the guts or the foundation of Gates of the Arctic by looking into that cut bank. You see that this ice here is permafrost, which underlies almost all of the park. And in recent years, this permafrost has begun radically melting, causing great slumps in the earth. I took this photograph a few miles north of the Arctic, of the gates of the Arctic National Park, and this shows a place where the permafrost has melted and created what scientists refer to as a thermokarst. And you can see the erosional process going on here as the waters are rinsing through these thermokarsts. And this is utterly changing the landscape through much of the circumpolar Arctic. And even worse than that, there's methane stored in this permafrost. So as it melts, we are exponentially increasing the greenhouse gases in the upper atmosphere, thus the effects of climate change. So whether you're in the most remote national park of them all, Gates of the Arctic in northernmost Alaska, with the least amount of people, or here in places like Yellowstone, waiting in line to get in, I encourage you to get away from the pavement as quickly as you can. I encourage you to find those parks where there aren't long waiting lines. You can see here in this graphic from the Atlas of the National Parks, the 15 most visited national parks. Great Smoky Mountains now has over 12.5 million visitors a year. As of last year, I'm sure that record will be broken this year, with Grand Canyon and Rocky falling close behind them. Crowded places like Zion, here you see one of the most popular trails, Angel's Landing, and we've just got to learn to avoid these places and spread out the uses unless you want to join the Mamba line here. It's very easy in a place like Zion or other national parks to get off the beaten path, get into the backcountry. If you're willing to walk for more than a few hours, you can have many of these parks seemingly to yourself. I encourage you all to get wet. It's a seminal experience. Get out in the weather, experience the weather. And here in Kenai Fjords National Park, I would encourage you, as I have done, to take your children to the national parks. Just don't let them push you into the rivers, as my son was trying to do here. And go with your friends, of course. What better place to experience the joys of camaraderie than in a remote wilderness national park? And I think that all the hype about water filters is sometimes overrated. There are many springs you can drink from, and to me, there's no purer experience than to cup your hands, bend down, and drink directly from the source. The national parks have followed the lead of Heinrich Baran and created these magnificent panoramas all their own of such places as Katmai National Park and Preserve. And these maps are literally works of art. So I encourage you too to study these maps. This is what the Park Service wants us to do, to utilize these services. And if you're in a place such as Katmai, be sure to look up away from where the bears are feeding and take the sort of picture that I got here. It's the unexpected wonders that are just as pleasing as the things that you are initially drawn to in these national parks. And if you're going to bring the kitchen sink in a national park, taking a raft is the great way to do it here in Tachincini National Park on this river trip that led us into Glacier Bay National Park. And I caution you to use toilets wisely in national parks. Look in before you sit down. And finally, be sure to get out in the wintertime. In wintertime, you can have these national parks literally to yourself. Here in the backside of Grand Teton National Park and 20 below, the world became a magical icing frosted over world like nothing I've ever seen before. And challenge yourself. I guess you know by now that that's what I like to do in national parks on some trips. I should add, I started this lecture by sharing with you a trip that I took in 1976 to Denali. I returned 4 years later and was lucky enough to get to the summit on my 60th birthday. I think that getting up in the air is an essential part of understanding the national parks, whether it's here in Denali, but make sure you choose your bush pilot wisely. I never flew with this particular bush pilot again. But getting up in the air, such as has been done here in Yellowstone over the Great Caldera, you will come away with a sense of awe and wonders and the colors that you might miss from the ground. So this is what our national parks are about. It's about experiencing the wonders and coming away awestruck, as we were here in the depths of Canyonlands National Park, looking at these 1,000-year-old petroglyphs. So I return us once again to some of the words from the Organic Act of 1916. How can we continue to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects while leaving it unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations? That is the challenge that we will face as the parks become more and more popular. If you're interested in learning more about the national parks, I've written a number of stories in media, which you can find on my website, jonathanwaterman.com, if you go to Atlas Media. And you can see stories such as the one I most recently did for Men's Journal about the challenges of the Everglades and that restoration project that I've mentioned in brief, described here in this article. So thank you, everyone. Perhaps it's time for some questions.
Hey, Jon, that was excellent. Thank you so much for such an inspiring presentation while we've all been housebound. And I've got some questions that have come in during your talk on Facebook. And the first one is from Susan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The first question's from Susan, and that was, what was in that toilet?
That was an automated National Park Service wiper in that toilet.
I think she thought it was some type of maybe detrimental thing in there. So that
no, more seriously, we had to dig that latrine into the glacier, and we put the toilet over before one of the diggers could get out.
Okay. Then we had a question from Sonny. I think when you were talking about the Everglades, wondering if you knew where the pythons came from.
Yeah, apparently during a hurricane, I believe in the 90s, they were escaped from a exotic zoo somewhere near the Everglades. That's the best guess of where these pythons came. And of course, the habitat was perfect for them, with many prey, and so the population took off. As
invasives have in many parts of the country. And this kind of ties into another question that came in. I know you've been up in Alaska a number of times. Have you seen changes in the wildlife or their habitat during your visits up there? Well, of course, the thermal karst is one of the most disturbing things, where the permafrost is melting, but changes to the habitat of wildlife. Sure. Well, the waters are warming, for instance. I've seen grizzly bear far up on the glaciers within Wrangell St. Elias National Park, perhaps just because it was so warm. Grizzly bear was seeking food, i.e. us. Off the top of my head, I can't give you much more than that, but it's a great research question for Google. All right. Here's another one. You talked a lot about the Organic Act and ended with the purpose of the national park system, and that was quite educational. But Sonny also had a question: is mining and ranching allowed on national parks, or at least any of the ones you visited? There are
occasionally in holdings within national parks, but for the most part, there are 2 national parks in all of the national park system, within the 62 national parks anyway, not all 419, that do allow cattle grazing. And as for mining, there are, I believe, in holdings within a couple of parks. And in many instances, the Park Service has acquired those in holdings, but I believe that some still exist. But generally, the answer to the question is no, that mining and ranching is not allowed. And we have heard a lot in the last few years about development within national parks, particularly oil and gas. And for instance, the shrinking of Bears Ears National Monument in order that those lands could be opened up to oil. Well, the only way they could do that was by shrinking the monument itself. They couldn't proceed with oil and gas drilling within the monument. They had to shrink it so that which they're still in the process of trying to do before they could exploit these resources.
Okay. You showed us a pretty shocking image of the beetle destruction in, I think, Rocky Mountain Park, if I'm not mistaken. Is any progress being made to stop the beetles?
Well, there's very little they can do. I mean, what we can do is curb our use of fossil fuels is the big answer to the question. But on a more local, on the ground basis, they can apply insecticides or various insecticides to the trees. But when you're talking about a forest with millions of trees, it's quite difficult to do. So they do that, in fact, to trees around visitor centers or places within the park where they don't want the trees to become infested with beetles. But it's a scourge. It's like a insect pandemic. The insects are going crazy, and this is because the winters are not as cold as they used to be, and it doesn't kill the beetles off during the winter time. And then you add these warm summer conditions and diseased trees to the mix, and it's a perfect storm for different species of beetles.
Brittany Grouch wrote in, she wanted to know your thoughts on urban parks and perhaps their importance as wildlife corridors.
Well, they're becoming increasingly important as our population expands. For instance, we have places like Cuyahoga National Park in Ohio. It's one of several urban national parks among the 62 park system. And not only do these allow people from the inner city to get out and experience these parks, but in Cuyahoga, they were able to restore this incredibly toxic dump within the middle of the park. So it became a template and an example for other national parks about what we could do to restore these landscapes. Now, as for migration corridors, well, sure, that's an important concept, particularly in places like Yellowstone, where we've created not only an adjoining national park, Grand Teton National Park, but wilderness areas and protected national forest lands that surround the parks. And those wilderness corridors are essential. And in urban national parks, in a place like Cuyahoga, I don't think that we have that opportunity to create those corridors like we do out west, where there are many more protected federal lands. But I wish we could.
Sure. No, nobody asked you this question, probably because they were too embarrassed, but I'll go ahead and ask it. What's your favorite national park?
All of them is the answer.
Oh, don't give me the old favorite child answer. Well, what's one of your favorites? Where would you like to go to if we didn't have COVID and you could just go wherever you wanted?
Obviously, I'm very partial to Denali, but I have not been to all 62 national parks, and so I'm very psyched about visiting places like Dry Tortugas, like Isle Royale, excuse me, in northern Lake Superior. But I am very partial to the Alaskan parks. And I will return to Denali again, even though I've been there many times. There are still portions of the park I haven't been into that I hope to trek through.
You gave a very inspiring coda at the end, encouraging people to go to national parks. And in fact, COVID seems to have driven more people to national and state parks and wildlife refuges. And you mentioned people could go off season to parks like Teton, and we used to go off season up to Acadia, my wife and I. They're not as busy, but are there some parks that are also just less busy in summer and fall when most people go to them?
Well, yes, of course. There are many parks that don't have the numbers, and it's very easy for listeners to do that research because the National Park Service every year updates statistics for each national park, and not just the 62, but all 419. So you can see what the numbers are, for instance, in a place like Isle Royale, which I believe is the least visited national park in the lower 48. Dry Tortugas is probably another good one because you can only get there by boat or airplane. So generally those places that don't have a lot of easy access are the ones you want to go to. And that's why Gates of the Arctic is the least visited, because there in northern Alaska, you can't walk into that park. You can't drive to it. You really have to, there is one way to walk into it, but with great difficulty. And those are the parks I encourage people to visit.
So John, what have you been doing during the pandemic to keep yourself sane and healthy?
I've been out on the public lands a great deal this summer. And never before have I seen so many people as this. For instance, I've been happily climbing 14,000 foot peaks in Colorado. And I just am astonished by the numbers of people that are out there because people can't travel to foreign destinations. So people are really hitting the trails. I'm also concerned about this because I think that we have a whole new generation that might not know what the leave no trace is. And although we can manage this in our national parks somewhat, in the rest of our public lands, it's not as easy.
Now we're awaiting your book on the Atlas of the National Wildlife Refuges, hopefully in the near future. But more seriously, do you have any future projects coming up, or are you recovering still from this very rich, very comprehensive book you recently published?
Well, thank you for asking. I'm hoping to do 2 more books in this series. One which would be released in 2026, which would be more on historical parks.
Oh.
And another in between, hopefully in another couple of years, which I'm not yet signed on for, which will be about wild places, and which would include a number of wildlife refuges.
Well, John, do you have any last words of wisdom you want to share with people as we approach the end of our hour here?
Well, since I just mentioned leave no trace, I would like to ask those viewers listening still to share the word far and wide that we've got to start taking care of not only our national parks, but our public lands, and learning how to take only pictures, leave only footprints.
Well, John, I cannot thank you enough. This was exactly what a cabin fever bound historian, and I'm sure all our listeners needed, to see some beautiful places, to be inspired to go out in them all seasons of the year as we approach fall and winter, and just a really good natural history and cultural history lesson. I'm sorry we couldn't have you at NCTC in person, but the good news is people were able to hear you from as far away as California, and hopefully with the 2 new books coming, we'll have 2 opportunities to have you come out to NCTC in person. So a sincere thank you, and we will get you back out there. I'd also like to thank Once again, the Friends of NCTC, our nonprofit friends group who supports the public lecture series and has for the last 2 decades, and also all of you that took the time to tune in this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.